Good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Weimer, the Acting Director of the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance. And it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual conference. Since its inception in 2009, the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance has been a leading academic center of excellence dedicated to the study of European law in context. Here at ACELG, we're not just interested in the black letter of the law, but in the complex and dynamic ways in which law interacts with other social, political, economic, and cultural practices that shape the European project. We're not just interested in analyzing and describing these interactions either, but looking at them through the lens of the core constitutional values of the European Union, such as equality, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. One of the ways in which we fulfill our vision here at ACELG is by engaging with policy and public debates about the role of EU law in addressing key challenges of European integration. In the past, our conferences have dealt with the role of EU law in social justice, in the energy transition, in the development of new technologies, just to name some examples. And so today, in this spirit, and not less ambitiously, we have set ourselves the task to address the question of how EU law can help catalyze the transition to a sustainable system of food and agriculture. Food and agriculture are indeed topics that touch upon almost all aspects of our lives. They're not just essential for our survival and well-being, but also for our culture and identity. They're not just influenced by the individual choices that we make, but also by our collective policies and institutions. To talk about food and agriculture in the EU today is to talk about a system in need of radical transformation. A system that is currently unsustainable, unhealthy, and unjust. A system that is responsible for a large share of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, water pollution, deforestation, and animal suffering. A system that is failing to deliver on the promises of a healthy nutrition and food security, despite the cutting-edge technology at its disposal. And a system, lastly, that is undermining the values and principles that the EU stands for. Today's conference, and I'm very happy to see that, is gathering researchers, policymakers, stakeholders, and civil society to explore how EU law and governance could catalyze the transition to a different, more sustainable system. Our attention is indeed on the systemic challenge. What would it mean for EU law and governance to see food as a complex system? That is a system that operates through a web of complex relationships between people, nature, and animals, and whose ecological, socioeconomic, and cultural impacts result from these very relationships. The need for a food systems approach in European law and governance is widely recognized today, including by the EU institutions and the Farm to Fork strategy. It is also the basis for the proposed framework law on sustainable food systems, which we're going to discuss today. There is overall much discussion about the need to move from silos to systems. And yet, precisely this move is particularly challenging for EU law, because EU law has been instrumental in creating and maintaining the current unsustainable system of intensive industrial agri-food production in the first place. And EU law has done so precisely by creating policy silos, and by separating the different aspects and impacts of the food system from this web of complex relations that underpin it. As our keynote speaker Olivier De Schutter has argued in his work, EU policies are highly path-dependent, siloed, continuing to chip away at problems that are increasingly self-reinforcing and systemic. And so a systems approach requires a fundamental shift in EU's policies and institutions, especially in the common agricultural policy, which has historically favored a sectoral approach, largely ignoring or marginalizing the health, environmental, and social dimensions of food and agriculture. This raises difficult questions, such as whether EU law and governance are currently well equipped for a systems approach. Does EU law allow to see the world of food in a radically different way? What would a truly transformative EU food systems law look like? Before we dive into these substantive discussions, let me briefly comment on the political context that we are facing today. As you are well aware, the EU is going through a turbulent, uncertain period marked by multiple crises and conflicts, both internal and external. The COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the geopolitical tensions and conflicts, these are some of the developments that have put a strain on Europe's cohesion and solidarity and have threatened its ambitions. In this context, the European Green Deal, and especially the food transition, may seem less urgent than other issues such as competitiveness and security. Indeed, in the last months, we have witnessed a resurgence of old narratives and arguments that pit the economy against the environment, that favor short-term interests over long-term vision, and that resist change rather than embrace it. And so I think it is especially now that it is important for us to have a broad and inclusive discussion about the meaning of food sustainability. Now, we must remember that food sustainability is not a consensual concept, and that there is not one direction of progress here. Sustainability means different things to different actors in the food system, and given the power imbalances in the food system right now in terms of money, in terms of market power and epistemic power, these power imbalances mean that some actors have more influence and persuasion power over EU policies than others. And so I believe that it is an important task for EU policymakers and institutions today to enable an inclusive and democratic discussion about the meaning of food sustainability, in which distributional issues are openly addressed, and in which different visions and different voices can be heard and taken seriously. The history of agricultural transitions over the last 12,000 years is the history of societal choices, often made by a small circle of elite actors about the food system. And so perhaps to move towards food sustainability, we must first have food democracy. And that is also a topic that I hope we can discuss today. Very much looking forward to our discussions. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to do one important thing, and that is to thank those people, those amazing colleagues, together with whom I have organized this conference, and without whose hard work, dedication, and creativity we would not be here today. First, I'd like to thank Irte de Jong, whose ideas and open-mindedness have been invaluable in developing the program, in communicating with the speakers, and in making sure everybody was well prepared. Thank you, Irte. And second, I want to thank Alicia van der Werf, who has been the driving force behind the promotion, the format, all the logistics of this conference. Alicia has been an innovative and resourceful colleague who has been on top of things throughout this process. Both of you, thank you for being kind and reliable colleagues, and I really enjoyed working with you on this project. I also want to thank Ivana Izailovic and Giacomo Tajuri for brainstorming, sitting down with us at an early stage when we were still shaping the conference program, and that has certainly helped us getting started. Last but not least, I would like to thank the UVA catering service for keeping us well nourished today, and of course all the people who have grown and prepared our food. Now, it is a special pleasure for me to invite Professor Olivier De Schutter, our keynote speaker. And before you take the floor, I would like to introduce you, although I think to most people in this audience, you need no introduction. I just heard this morning that you are sort of a coryphée in the world of sustainable food governance. So still, I would like to say a couple of words about you. Olivier De Schutter is a professor of international human rights law at the University of Louvain in Belgium and at SciencePo in Paris. He is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights since 2020. He is also the co-chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, a group of independent experts who provide recommendations on how to transform agriculture and food systems. Before that, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Olivier has been involved in various civil society organizations, such as the International Federation for Human Rights, and has taught at several universities around the world, including UCLouvain, SciencePo, Columbia University, and UC Berkeley. He is the recipient of several awards and honors, such as the Franke Prize in 2013 and the James Beard Foundation Award in 2017. He has widely published on topics such as economic and social rights, economic globalization and human rights, and transnational corporations and human rights. Olivier, it is a pleasure to invite you to take the floor and give the keynote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and very warm welcome to all. I will be speaking from here in order to be able to see what you see on the screen up here. Great, full screen in pleasure. Thank you. So what I would I'm sure this is useful.
No, you don't need to use that.
So what I would like to do, thanking again Maria Weimer and the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance, in the few minutes I have, is recall where the discussions on transforming food systems in the EU comes from, and perhaps as a result of that discussion, recall what was expected from the Sustainable Food Systems Framework legislation that was part of the Farm to Fork Strategies commitments. Now, we have here, I believe, representatives from the institutions, from the European Commission in particular. They will say, we are still working on this. We know that the legislation will not be ready on time, and unfortunately, the prospect of the next elections in June, the very impressive score of Boerenburgerbeweging in the Netherlands, and of course, the situation created by the conflict in Ukraine resulted in a situation in which there is no appetite anymore for this framework legislation. And I deeply regret this. I was part of a group of experts that was meant to advise the European Commission on the Sustainable Food Systems Framework legislation. I say this with great respect. It was not well managed. We lost a precious 5-6 months in putting ideas forward without any real guidance being provided by the Commission, and I have lost faith in the prospect of that legislation being adopted. Now, that's one more reason, not one less reason, for academics, researchers to work on this topic. Let us try to reflect on what went wrong, on the power of lobbies in the EU, and on the gap between noble intentions and political will. Where do we come from? You have no need to be reminded, Maria said it all, of the urgency of the situation. Food systems are actually one important lever to achieve 4 goals. One is to improve the health of residents of the rise of obesity rates, the costs to healthcare systems of non-communicable diseases linked to obesity, the cost of endocrine disruptors that amounts to 1.8% of the European GDP, for example. These indicators show that first, for the health of Europeans, changing how we produce and consume food is important. There's a health crisis we are facing. Almost 1 million people every year die from preventable diseases linked to how we eat. That's number one. Secondly, there is an environmental crisis. This is a point Maria has emphasized. The loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions. 1/3 of man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems, right? About 12% from agriculture. The rest is transport, processing, packaging, or deforestation linked in particular to the need to produce crops for livestock feed. In the EU, it's a bit different. There is less deforestation still going on, but we have a very energy-intense food system, so that greenhouse gas emissions from how we produce food at the farm level, but also beyond in the whole food chain is very huge. That's a second crisis. The third crisis is the socio-economic crisis. Farmers would not survive without the subsidies from the common agricultural policy. My rough estimate is that 80% of the farms will disappear overnight without those subsidies. And so the question for us is, how do you change a system which is so heavily dependent on an unsustainable system of financing? Going to the wrong types of farming and not rewarding the farms that provide environmental services, but rewarding first and foremost the largest farms, because let's not forget that most of the money of the common agricultural policy is based on how much hectares you have, right? So the bigger you are, the better you are paid. And many small farms, as a result, disappear. They disappear also because they are not well equipped in achieving economies of scale and being competitive in global markets. And unfortunately, the sort of pressure to grow big or to disappear that was put on farmers since the 1960s, and when the CAP was established, this pressure continues today, despite the fact we know since many years that beyond a certain scale, bigness becomes counterproductive, right? In other words, you can't transform your ways of farming if you have large areas of land for which you're responsible. But I will return to this. So small farms are disappearing. That's the third crisis. The fourth crisis has to do with our relationship with the outer world. I still hear people saying the EU has a responsibility to feed the world because many countries are not able to provide for their own food security, and we need to export at a low price on global markets. This is ridiculous. The result of our subsidized farming system is to dump cheap food on the markets of countries that should instead be encouraged to invest in their own domestic food production. And these countries have now become addicted to cheap food. They basically produce for us raw materials that they need to export in order to have access to foreign currencies, allowing them to reimburse their foreign debt. But they themselves depend on imports of cheap, subsidized, processed foods that we produce for them. And that's not sustainable. It results in these countries not having any incentive to invest in supporting their own farmers, particularly small farmers, providing food for their local communities. And that's extremely difficult to get out from. We need, I will return to this point, Maria, but we need to think about transition in exactly those terms. How do we get rid of that kind of addiction? how do we move from the current unsustainable situation to one that is much more sustainable, but taking into account the constraints that many actors face in this situation in which they're locked. So these are the four crises, and we tried to address this in the years 2016 to, sorry, using the wrong thing. Okay, that's fine. So based on this diagnosis, IPES Food, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, tried to bring together a large number of actors in the years 2016, 2019, to develop what we called a common food policy. Now, this was provocative as a title. It's an eye wink, of course, to the common agricultural policy. And it was never meant to mean we want all that has to do with food production and consumption to be the competence of the EU. So it was not a call for a vast chunk of power being delegated to the EU, but it was about bringing together those different sectorial policies that relate to the whole food system and to bring this into a coherent framework for improved sustainability. So we call this a common food policy. It should have been called really an integrated food policy. That would have been less provocative and perhaps wiser. But never mind. We worked with a large number of actors. Our conviction, you see, is that even the best research will make no difference if it is not transdisciplinary, if it's not using the knowledge of social actors, if it's not building on their proposals, so that the proposals scientists, researchers make are not only well informed, but also legitimate. And so that the messages that come out from the research are bought into by actors who can put pressure on the institutions to deliver. So this is why we did not simply write a report or an academic study, as we all do as researchers. We created a movement. And the movement met in different fora. It involved not only NGOs, unions, and NGOs working on poverty, working on environment. I see the European Environmental Bureau is here, and they were extremely helpful in the process, working on public health, working on development cooperation. We also worked with policymakers, right? Much of our work was with members of the European Economic and Social Committee, the Committee of the Regions, the European Parliament, and yes, the European Commission. And we networked actors who were impatient with the current status quo and who sometimes, not really notifying their hierarchy, worked with us to develop this vision over these 3 years. So what did we do? We held policy labs in Brussels, right? Half-day long discussions where we brought together members of the institutions, NGOs, scientists to work on different aspects of the food systems. We went to Turin, Montpellier, Milan, Freiburg, the German Freiburg, to discuss how cities and local governments could contribute to reshaping food systems from the local level. And there were many groups working with local governments that worked with us, including ICLE. I always forget, anyway, it's Community of Local Governments. I forget what the acronym stands for. So we wanted to work also with municipalities and with the Milan Urban Food Policy Pacts that you may be aware of. We worked with a number of scientists from different countries and from different disciplines. And then we presented the results of this work in a forum, which was called the Food and Farming Forum, that we brought together in Brussels in May 2018. Based on that, and the very strong feedback we received, we drafted a final report presented in February 2019. The whole trajectory is the one we described here, but the graph is difficult for you to read from where you are. This is the Food and Farming Forum of February 2019, of May 2018. And what I would like to highlight is that this was a very hybrid format in which scientists, researchers, informed by the policy labs and by the city events we organized in the preceding years, presented a preliminary report that was then torn apart, reshaped, enriched by social actors. And the people you see here are not scientists, but they are experts. They are experts. They are small farmers. They work in anti-poverty groups. They work in development NGOs. They work at city level in reshaping urban food policies to provide or to support urban farming and so on. So real people who know what concrete obstacles they face. And it was a very productive 2 days of work that resulted in the final report we presented in February 2019. And the report, we have no time, of course, to discuss the content, but it basically looked at the different shifts we should make happen in food systems in order to move towards sustainable food systems. And we defined a pathway for this, looking at access to land and water, and how to maintain and enhance the soil health to allow soils to be more biodiverse and to function as carbon sinks better. We looked at how we could promote agroecology. We looked at how to promote healthy eating habits. We looked at how to improve the remuneration of farm workers and of farmers in more equitable food supply chains. And we looked at how trade could support this effort. And at the heart of this, there was a question of governance. And so it is very fitting, Maria, that it is the Center for European Law and Governance that convenes this discussion. I think at the heart of this issue is whether the EU is well equipped with the governance tools it has to make a transition. And there's a difference between being well equipped to manage crisis and being well equipped to make a transition, which requires long-term thinking, which requires avoiding path dependencies, which requires moving across different sectoral policies in a way that's coordinated. The report we presented had a number of institutional proposals. Some were short term, some were longer term. I don't really have time to discuss each of them, but the heart of the proposal is to say we can't continue with the current siloed approach, nor, however, should we create silo number 7 or 8, which is food. And there are proposals today for a DG food to be established. No, that is misunderstanding entirely the problem. We need the different sectoral policies to be coordinated with one another, to be integrated with one another. So we proposed that a vice president of the Commission be in charge of transforming food systems across different DGs, that in each DG we have one focal point on food systems transformation. But no, we do not need a new DG on food that will be captured by the lobbies. And that will be basically DG Agri revamped. Right? No, it's really important. And it's the exact opposite of integrated policies to have a new DG tasked with food, because that would be basically strengthening food supply chains without looking at the various areas that have to be transformed so that all the food system be reshaped. So, as I said, in the course of our 3 years long process, we worked with many actors, and as a result, a number of positions were adopted by different actors. The European Economic and Social Committee adopted at least 3 important opinions on this issue. And as researchers, let me just say, we should not underestimate the importance of the European Economic and Social Committee. Yes, they do not have decision-making power, but they, at the same time, have often been very vanguard in the proposals they make, and they did these opinions on food systems reform that were extremely well documented, and they do this, of course, with the members of the European Economic and Social Committee that represent people who are real actors in their national systems, right? Not just politicians who are elected by voters. And they adopted opinions on more sustainable food systems, on civil society's contribution to the development of a comprehensive food policy in the EU, and on promoting healthy and sustainable diets in the EU. All 3 opinions, we worked very closely with them to shape them. The Committee on the Regions also adopted an opinion towards a sustainable EU food policy, and we worked quite closely with the Joint Research Committee of the European Commission, the research branch of the European Commission, and with the European Environmental Agency, as well as with SCA, which is the scientific advisors of the European Commission. So finally, that was what we presented before the elections of May 2019. And in July, Ursula von der Leyen was elected as president of the European Commission, announcing this Green Deal, part of which was this farm to fork strategy formulated in May 2020. What did we insist on? And to which extent does the farm to fork strategy respond to these expectations that were expressed? Well, we put forward 4 priorities. First, I already mentioned integration across policy areas. It's very striking that today, in the absence of a solid, coherent, integrative framework, policies in the EU, at best, ignore each other, at worst, neutralize one another. So, for example, we have a concern expressed about the rise of obesity and the fact that we are killing ourselves, literally, 1 million deaths per year by eating unhealthily. And at the same time, we have a common agricultural policy that essentially subsidizes the provision of inputs to processing food companies, encouraging the dumping of ill health on the place of Europeans. The common agricultural policy is not fit for purpose if the purpose is to provide healthy eating for Europeans. And to a large extent, health policies try to make up for the failures of the common agricultural policy to subsidize the right things. Or to take another example, we would like a new generation of farmers to emerge. We know that the farming sector is very old in the sense that in my country, Belgium, for example, the average age of the farmer is 55. Yet the common agricultural policy system of subsidies, given that it's linked to the hectares under control, result in agricultural land being speculated on and becoming unaffordable for young farmers. In Belgium today, if you want to enter into farming and you want to buy, 20 hectares of land, basically, you'll have to accept to be indebted for 30 years. And the price of farmland has increased so much that it's impossible to become a farmer unless you inherit from your father or mother. So it's very bizarre that we provide incentives to young farmers without addressing the situation of subsidies and the speculation this leads to. We have environmental services from farmers that we try to reward better, and reform after reform, the CAP is becoming greener, but at the same time, the training farmers receive and the advice they get is chiefly from the input suppliers. Right? So there are many such inconsistencies that a coherent approach would have to address. The second is very dear to my heart. I mentioned the labs we had in Montpellier, in Freiburg, in Turin, and Milan. Many things are happening at the local level, at the regional level, that are not supported by the member states or by the EU level. And my image of what's happening is an image of tectonic plates. In the 1960s, we shaped food systems that were basically supporting efficiency gains, economies of scale, competitiveness on global markets. Basically, the bigger you are, the better. And the farmers were incentivized, as I said, to provide large volumes of stuff on the markets at a low price. And today people have something else, but they face this sort of inert system inherited from the past, 60 years ago, And it's very difficult for those alternatives to emerge because of the inconsistency between the EU level policies and the national member state level policies and what's being done at the city and regional level. And many people I spoke to in cities, in regions, tell me it's very difficult to change food systems locally because of these obstacles we face. First, the small local food chains are not competitive. They are too expensive for, low-income households. And what do we do? Especially if the food prices increase, they will revert to the low-cost options. And secondly, many rules are not adapted to small food systems and to sustainable food systems. For example, many schools, many public administrations would like to put in their contracts that local farmers should be supported, that sustainable farming should be given a premium and so on, and the rules on public procurement are not adapted to rewarding local production. And there are many such examples. So that's the second concern. The third concern was, as I said, governance for transition. And this is perhaps what we mostly would like to discuss today in the context of the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance. I believe we need to think about the governance tools that could allow a transition to be achieved. And for me, this means three things. First, it means having a whole of government approach, which in this case means covering the different segments of the food chain and different aspects of the food system together. That's number one. Because, for example, what technologies we invest in, what system of subsidies we have, what food safety regulations we adopt, it must be aligned with the need to move towards more localized, territorialized, and sustainable food systems. So all these changes must happen together, is what I mean. Secondly, we need the different actors to be held accountable for results by defining not just the end vision we want to achieve, but also the pathway to get there with a time frame for achievements, right? So that every 6 months, we take stock of the progress achieved and we hold accountable actors for lack of progress. This is what we would have wanted to see in the Sustainable Food Systems Framework Law. A calendar, time-bound objectives, indicators of progress, and monitored by a body such as the EU Food Policy Council. That is the third component of this governance for transition framework. Now, the reason why we need this may be understood perhaps from this slide that describes or tries to describe how we are locked into a system that has what might be called positive feedback loops, in the sense that we have self-reinforcing mechanisms across the system that make it very difficult to unlock. The basic argument made in this slide is that the search for efficiency in production with the feed the world narrative that is dominant leads the policymakers to support large-scale farmers much more than small-scale farmers, who instead are encouraged to switch to becoming bigger and more efficient, achieving economies of scale. As a result, these farmers are better supported by research, including the development of new varieties of plants and of course, other technologies. And the produce of these large farmers is what the big food processing companies and retailers want: uniformity, volume, low costs. And that, of course, results in these big actors influencing and strengthening the narrative about feeding the world, as these actors are extremely adroit at translating or converting their economically dominant position into political influence. That is what we see. Many scholars have studied this. The large economic actors have privileged access to policymakers and can reshape the regulatory and subsidies environment for their benefit, right? So they convert their economic power into political influence. And we need to break those positive feedback loops that are not very positive in their impacts. And we need to do this by amending the governance system. And that's why we need more democracy, right? Maria was referring to food democracy. I believe this is indeed very important. This is why we promoted the idea of an EU Food Policy Council, an idea that was also supported by the European Economic and Social Committee. And this is a picture of a meeting we had in Brussels in the premises of the European Economic and Social Committee, where what such a food policy committee should look like was discussed. And we had there, people from DG Santé, whom I see, from DG Agri, different members of the European Parliament, and so on. And we discussed there what this could look like. Now, that would have been in the Sustainable Food Systems Law. If we don't have this legislation, I think the European Economic and Social Committee should take the initiative of building motu proprio, at its own initiative, a European Food Policy Council. After all, you only have the power you exercise. And the European Economic and Social Committee should say, we representatives of civil society and the different, social and economic actors in the EU, we decide to have a permanent council that could meet every month, for example, to discuss sustainable food systems in the EU. And if this is not grounded in a legislative framework, we don't care. The European Economic and Social Committee can itself play this monitoring role that it is entirely legitimate to fulfill. And when we see how food policy councils function in cities, in regions, even sometimes at national level, I believe an EU Food Policy Council could be extremely effective in holding institutions to account and ensuring that we all move together towards fulfilling this very same vision. And so that is what I would like to close with. I think the current situation is one that, of course, is not particularly promising, given that the member states are quite reluctant to make any progress on the agenda of the Green Deal, and the Farm to Fork strategy is no exception. But this is one part of the policy that has very strong support from very wide parts of European society. So the European Commission has, if not the mandate of member states, it has the commission of us and of civil society groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much.